Winston as Churchill, The World Crisis, Volume 5, Chapter 11, The Battle of Lemberg. The Battle of the Gnila-Lipa has two phases. The first began on the 26th. The three Austrian corps, the 12th, 3rd and 11th, advanced in high hopes to the Gnila-Lipa, expecting to crush the heads of inferior Russian forces. But the Russians were not only vastly superior, they were moving forward very slowly with the utmost precaution. They were expecting at any moment to come in contact with the main force of the Austrian army, and the heads of all their columns were therefore substantially deployed. The Austrian attacks all miscarried. Under the influence of the doctrine that the offensive was the only form of war, the Austrian divisions were launched to the attack, frequently disconnected from each other and without artillery preparation. Everywhere they were repulsed. Not only defeat, but panic overtook a large portion of the Third Army. The Russian front, growing stronger every hour, overlapped as well as outweighed the Austrian line. The shock of collision was all in favor of the heavier Russian attacks. By nightfall, the whole of the Third Army was in retreat. Two whole divisions, indeed, were driven in such disorder and terror from the field that they only rallied in Lemberg, 25 miles from the scene of the battle. Masses of routed Austrian troops streamed into Lemberg throughout the night. The next morning it was clear to AOK that their Third Army had sustained a brutal and shattering blow. At the same time, all reports now carried to headquarters the news of enormous Russian columns far exceeding any forces dreamt of in this quarter coming up abreast of the Gnila-Lipa throughout its entire length. At 8 a.m. on the morning of the 27th, Conrad ordered the retirement of the whole Third Army to a line close in front of Lemberg. He also ordered Auffenberg, now just becoming deeply involved in the Battle of Komarov, to return the three divisions of the Archduke Joseph in motion towards his right flank. Both these measures were justified by the facts. However, less discouraging reports from the Third Army led Conrad to sanction their remaining on the line of the Gnila-Lipa, and at Auffenberg's insistence he permitted the Archduke Joseph to continue his march on the flank of the northern battle. Actually, the Third Army was outnumbered by nearly 3-1. Along the Gnila-Lipa, the Russians employed 292 battalions, 162 squadrons and 750 guns against 115 Austrian battalions, 91 squadrons and 376 guns. But it must be remembered that General Ivanov presumed that he was about to meet the main strength of the Austrian army, and that hitherto he had only encountered their leading forces. He thought he had their weight in front of his left wing. In a country with few roads like Galicia, the movements of these great armies involved columns of 25 and 30 miles long on every practicable route. Thus, the rear half of the enemy was at any given moment 2 days' march from the fighting line. So far the Russians had conquered with their heavy advance guards alone. Now they must prepare for battle on the greatest scale. They therefore halted for 2 days to allow their columns to close up and deploy. In these 2 days the Austrian Third Army managed to get into a fighting posture along the Gnila-Lipa. It is said that if the Russians had swept down on the 28th and 29th, they could, with their great superiority, have routed finally the Austrian Third Army. The Grand Duke, preoccupied with the position of Plehve's army in the Battle of Komarov, and judging more accurately than Ivanov the strength of the Austrians in front of Lemberg, ordered Ivanov to cancel his orders for the halt for deployment, and to press on at once with his troops towards Lemberg and the enemy. These orders had to be obeyed. Nevertheless, it was more than 48 hours before the Russians were again in movement. The Grand Duke was both right and wrong. But the commander-in-chief of the Southwest Front and his powerful staff had no intention of being hurried into a disaster. They bowed and they delayed until their arrangements were complete. This brings us to the Second Battle of the Gnila-Lipa, or Second Battle of Lemberg, as it is sometimes called, which opened on August 30. When the Russian advance was resumed, it was irresistible. From daylight on the 30th, Brusilov's artillery bombarded the Austrian position, and at about 10 a.m. the Russian infantry, in overpowering strength, assaulted and broke the whole front of the 12th Austrian Corps. The disordered and panic-stricken troops attempted vainly to reform after a retreat of 7 miles, but a Russian cavalry division threw them again into flight. Similar scenes were enacted along the whole front. All the roads leading back to Lemberg became a seething mass of terror-stricken troops, guns, wagons, and vehicles of every kind, intermingled with the fugitive inhabitants. By nightfall the Austrian Third Army seemed in dissolution. It had fled from the field in rout and ruin and had only been halted after 18 miles. Now and henceforward the mere cry, "Kosaken kommen," the Cossacks are coming, was sufficient to throw regiments and brigades into confusion. All these harsh and insulting phrases are drawn from the Austrian official history. We now leave for a moment these battlefields drenched with blood, upon which for a week 7 armies together comprising at least 2 million men have been in deadly grapple, for agonies no less intense in Konrad's bleak headquarters at Przemysl. Since the morning of the 26th, 2 great battles had been thundering beyond the northern and eastern horizons. As Konrad's hopes in the north brightened steadily, his anxieties from the east mounted to a monstrous scale. The fiery commander was torn between the opposite stresses of the 2 fields, the promise of victory and the threat of ruin. The first shock of the defeat of the Third Army on the 26th had led him on the 27th to suspend the northward movement of the Archduke Joseph's 3 divisions. But later reports had shown that Brudermann had managed to reform along the Gnila-Lipa and that the Russians were not pursuing. So Konrad had allowed the Archduke to proceed, and he was soon crucially involved in the Battle of Komarov. Meanwhile, the bad condition of the Third Army and the enormous masses of Russians now plainly closing up for a decisive onslaught were obvious. Russki and Brusilov were already within a day's march of Lemberg and within 3 days' march of the communications of both the Austrian armies fighting in the north. Konrad was like a man about to seize a prize behind a dike which was about to burst. On the 28th he again demanded the return of the Archduke's divisions. But Auffenberg, who now saw what he hoped was a decisive victory within his grasp, argued stubbornly, and again in the end Konrad yielded. The truant Second Army was now assembling in strength to the southward. Konrad decided to increase his hazards. 8 of the 10 days between the 20th and 30th days of Russian mobilization, during which he had counted on winning a great victory, had gone. The Russian armies were now reaching their full establishment, and the weight of numbers became daily more adverse to the Austrians. To Bolfras he wrote for the Emperor's eye a letter so full of interest and self-revelation that it may be allowed to interrupt the military narrative. August 27. In the gravest moment of my life I am in receipt of your much appreciated letter of the 24th and 25th. I hasten to answer it, but wish only to add that, as I write, the general battle is proceeding, which will decide the fate of the monarchy. There is not much to say about our successes compared with those of the Germans, mainly because the German victories have been gained at our expense. 4 of the 100 divisions which Germany is forming, she has given only 9 regular and 3 Landwehr divisions to the Eastern Theatre, and sent all the others to the West. Thus the enormous weight of the Russian army is thrown upon us, and moreover we have the war against Serbia and Montenegro to conduct. In this we lack the assistance of Romania, which was always counted upon for the war against Russia, and in addition, Italy's defection has led to Germany sending 5 promised reserve divisions, not to the east, but to the west. With the policy which has led to this result, I have nothing to do. Kann ich nichts. Foreseeing the events which have now arisen, I advised a course of action in 1909 and again in 1912, but in vain. It is a malicious freak of fate that it is I who now have to bear the consequences of that neglect. The enclosed copy of a report by Potiorek gives an authentic picture of the failure in Serbia. That a complete infantry division should simply scatter and abandon its guns and material was the less to be expected, as our troops otherwise are everywhere fighting just as gallantly as the Germans, who are engaged not against Russians, but only against Frenchmen. After this striking exposure of his standard of values, Conrad continues. The transfer of the 4th Corps to the north is an urgent necessity, the more so when it is realized that Russia, besides her first-line divisions, will from now on bring her reserve divisions also into the field. Our troops are today already engaged with these. It was thus high time for us to take the offensive, for we should otherwise be opposed by a crushing superiority, and so must set the dice rolling before the 4th Corps are here. And moreover, the enemy advancing from all sides has left us no more time for delay. The offensive, which began with the victorious battle at Krasnik on the 23rd, 24th and 25th of August, has today led to the general battle. The troops are suffering heavy losses, especially from the superior Russian artillery. What the outcome of this battle of giants will be lies in the hand of fate. We have here the conviction of having fulfilled our obligations to the best of our knowledge and conscience. That must suffice us. Thank you for your kind inquiry after my sons. Whether they are still alive, I do not know. Both sets of pressures upon Conrad now increased. The shattering defeat of his Third Army on the 30th was matched by the hope and prospect that Auffenberg was about to surround Pleve and gain a tremendous victory. The ordeal shows us the measure of Conrad's force of will. He resolved to secure for Auffenberg 2 more days in which to conquer, and to endure for that space the hourly increasing peril from the east. This was his greatest decision. Nor did it fail. The Russians advanced but slowly and with every precaution. They took 2 days to traverse the 18 miles which the Austrians had yielded so hurriedly on the 30th. It was not till September 1 that they came into contact with the new Austrian front before Lemberg. Formed of the fragments of routed divisions and of exhausted, nerve-broken troops in much confusion, it was only a shadow. Nevertheless, it seemed from the enemy's side a line of battle in position. The 2 days which Auffenberg had demanded had been accorded him. Let us see what use he was able to make of them. August 31 was to be Auffenberg's great day. Ever since the 26th, he had been fighting his way forward on both flanks of Pleve's army, which was now enclosed on 3 sides. On the 30th, Dankel's army, pressing hard towards Lublin, had captured Krasnostav, thus threatening to separate Ewart from Pleve. Pleve's position was critical. His 3 corps about Komarov might well be surrounded altogether. On the night of the 30th he had issued orders for their immediate retreat. But was it not already too late? Here then was the prize for which Auffenberg had fought so hard and skillfully, and for which Konrad was running such desperate risks at Lemberg. The Austrian plan was simple, obvious even. On the right, the Archduke Joseph, with his 3 divisions and 2 cavalry divisions, was to advance westward to the Hushwa and also destroy the bridges on the Bug. On the left, the Archduke Peter, with a similar infantry force marching from the neighborhood of Dub, was to turn and envelop the Russian right. Meanwhile, the center of the Austrian army would press at every point the wavering Russians. The net, which had been cast around the 3 Russian corps, seemed about to close. One more thrust on either flank, and the encirclement of 100,000 men would be complete. Nor were there any other Russian troops near enough to interfere. Fortune was now to play a mischievous trick. By an extraordinary coincidence, the movement of both the Austrian wings was paralyzed by exactly the same kind of accident. An aeroplane reported to the Archduke Joseph on the right that a Russian division was marching up behind him from the east. Cavalry patrols reported to the Archduke Peter that Russian battalions were encircling the northern flank of his turning movement. The division in front of him and the cavalry had already retired. His own flank was compromised. In fact, however, the Russian battalions did not exist, and the Russian division on the opposite wing was only a few squadrons of cavalry and horse artillery scouting forward on the extreme northern flank of General Russki's army. But both the archdukes took similar action on the false reports. The Archduke Joseph sent back both his cavalry and parts of 2 of his infantry divisions to the Solokia River to protect his rear, and was not strong enough to advance with the rest. The Archduke Peter fell back 7 miles to Zamość. Thus, at the moment when the steel doors were about to clank together and imprison 3/4 of the Russian Fifth Army, they swung wider than ever on their hinges. And through the gap of 20 miles, Pleves' army marched in good order to safety. Here died the last Austrian chance of victory. It was not until the morning of September 1 that Auffenberg realized what had occurred. With fierce anger and dismay he ordered the advance to be resumed, and his whole army set off in hot pursuit. They were masters of Komarov and the enemy's position. They had captured thousands of prisoners and many guns. Their 7 days' bloody fighting had won them the honors of the field. It had won them little else. Let us return to Konrad's headquarters at Przemysl, where the sum of all these events, accidents, and apprehensions is computed from hour to hour. Konrad had hoped that his battered and demoralized Third Army would nevertheless be able to maintain itself in front of Lemberg till Auffenberg had triumphed. But on the night of September 1 panic broke out in a Hungarian brigade which rapidly spread, and the whole division fled in disorder into the city. On the right, the Cossacks stampeded the 11th Austrian Cavalry Division, which did not draw rein for 12 miles. The Russian line, gathering constantly in weight, extended round both flanks of the quavering Third Army, and Brudermann, with Konrad's reluctant assent, yielded Lemberg and fell back 20 miles to a line of lakes and marshes along the Veresitsa. By September 1, all illusions had been swept away. The veil now lifted from the theater of war, and the general situation of the masses on both sides was now plain to the Austrian headquarters. The weight and peril of the Russian advance from the east was now insupportable. In these straits Konrad's courage and resource did not desert him. Had he commanded German troops or even fresh Austrian troops, he might have drawn from the very collapse of disastrous battle the means of victory. He rose to the occasion in his headquarters, but his soldiers, asked for more than they could perform, did not rise with him. Certainly the plans which he produced in the intense stresses of these events command respect. His Third Army had retreated behind Lemberg, and it was to be expected that the Russian center would press forward at their heels through the city. He had observed that the general tendency of the Russian advance was inclining constantly to the northward, and that his Second Army, at last in line, overlapped their left in the south. He now ordered this army to advance upon the Russian left and rear. He ordered Auffenberg to abandon the pursuit of Pleve, to turn his Fourth Army right about and march south instead of north. Their rear covered by the Archduke Joseph, now become rearguard instead of heading the pursuit. By so doing, he sacrificed all hope of further successes in the northern battle. On paper, at least, his plan was formidable. The southward march of Auffenberg would bring his army down upon Russki's right flank and rear. The Second Army, wheeling up from the south, would strike the Russians from the opposite quarter, and while they pressed forward through Lemberg towards the Third Army on the Veresitsa, they would be smitten simultaneously on both sides. We must honor his spirit and mental resiliency. We may admire his conceptions, but the materials at his disposal were not strong enough to convert them into reality. In fact, he would have been a wiser and a better general if he had without more delay ordered on September 1 or 2 a general retreat of all the Austrian armies to the San. However, the orders went forth from Przemysl, and the weary and battle-strained Austrian armies set themselves in motion accordingly. We must now repair to the Russian headquarters. The Stavka had by this time accurately divined the general situation and knew where the Austrian masses were. The Grand Duke had no intention of pressing any further advance from the east. On the contrary, the longer the Austrians remained on the Veresitsa, and as far forward as the neighborhood of Lemberg, the greater his chance of destroying them. His new Ninth Army descended the Vistula from Ivangorod, was now coming down upon Dunkel's left and rear, while Ewart attacked him in front. Here was the decisive strategic thrust, and the one he had intended from the first. Moreover, on the night of September 1 to 2, tidings calculated to shake the strongest nerve had reached him. Something had happened in East Prussia, something appalling, incomprehensible, and measureless in its terrible significance. Something had happened which invested the Austrian efforts to envelop Pleve with new menace. He was deeply anxious for Pleve and did not know whether or in what condition he would escape. He therefore ordered Russki's whole army to turn from westward to northwestward and march to Pleve's aid. He ordered the greater part of Brusilov's army to incline to the north in touch with Russki, leaving only 2 corps around Lemberg in front of the Austrian right. In short, the Russian armies were to sideslip to their right, withhold their left hand, and press for a vast strategic entrapment with their right. The Battle of Rava Russka. All these movements on both sides now began to operate simultaneously, and a curious situation resulted. Auffenberg's army, marching south to fall on Russki's right and rear, began to brush with their left elbows, as it were, against Russki's army marching north upon the opposite course. Neither commander could understand what was happening. Auffenberg had expected to attack Russki in flank and Russki to attack Auffenberg in rear. As the true position gradually dawned upon them, Russki faced west to fall upon Auffenberg, and Auffenberg, under the pressure of his attack, pivoted his whole army on its left, and in 2 days, with much difficulty and considerable skill, formed front against him. At the same time, in the south, the Austrian Second Army, dragged about in and out of trains for so many days, arriving amid disasters and an atmosphere of panic, made no headway against the weak Russian southerly flank, and eventually took station along the Verestitsa on the right of its maimed companion, the Third. By September 8, as the whole scene clarified, the 4th, 3rd, and 2nd Austrian armies stood at last in a single line facing east to resist the attack of only 2 Russian armies in their front, but with no other guard for their northern flank and line of retreat than the hard-pressed Dunkel, from whom they were separated by a gap of 40 miles. Opposite this gap, as yet unconscious of its existence, stood the whole of Plehve's army in good order and the cavalry corps of General Dragomirov. On the evening of the 9th, Conrad, still undaunted, demanded a final effort of his worn-out troops. He realized that the whole of Ruzsky's army was now in front of Auffenberg, and that consequently he had only Brusilov in front of his 2nd and 3rd armies. He was therefore in superior strength on the southern part of the front. He ordered both these armies to advance, wheeling as they did so to take Brusilov in flank simultaneously with renewed attacks by Auffenberg upon Ruzsky. He had penned these orders when a message arrived from Dunkel that he was forced by the general situation and his own to order the retirement of his army behind the Sun River. Still Conrad persisted in his plan. September 9 was therefore the greatest battle day yet seen upon the eastern front. Both sides had marched far and fought long and hard, and both attacked simultaneously. Conrad motored to Grodek and close to the battlefront endeavored to inspire his troops by his presence. But the attacks of the 2nd and 3rd armies, despite their local superiority, made no progress, and very severe fighting, which lasted the whole day, left the fronts unchanged. Both Ruzsky and Brusilov, however, reported that the Austrian line in front of them was too strong to be broken. They thus paid their joint unconscious tribute to Conrad's tenacity. The final blow was now to be delivered from the north. General Dragomirov's cavalry corps had penetrated deeply into the gap between Auffenberg and Dunkel. Plehve, whose army was not, as Conrad had assumed, a disorganized mass, but in good fighting order, followed corps after corps behind them, leaving the 3 divisions of the Archduke Joseph on their left hand. The whole of this great force was already in rear of Auffenberg's right, and their march on the 11th would have involved his complete encirclement. He had already in the nick of time drawn in the Archduke Joseph's divisions southward to strengthen his own left wing, but neither he nor Conrad had any idea how powerful were the Russian forces now traversing his rear, or what fatal points they would reach on the 11th and the 12th. Fortune, whose caprice had robbed Auffenberg of his victory on the 31st, now made him a handsome amend. For this purpose she had previously bestowed upon the Russians a powerful wireless apparatus. Early in the morning of the 11th, this instrument lifted up its voice and in clear tones, unmuffled by cipher, ordered the 2 left corps of Plehve's army to reach the 2 hamlets, Chisanov and Brusno, that day. The unexpected message amazed both Austrian commanders and showed them, as by a lightning flash, the extent of their peril. Conrad, still hoping against hope, ordered the Archduke Joseph to march against the intruders and make more room to the rear. But Auffenberg, who knew that these divisions, which had been marching and fighting continuously for 18 days, were now reduced from over 50,000 to barely 10,000 men, did not pass the order on. Without losing an hour he began his retreat southeast, and guided by further Russian wireless messages, extricated his army from its mortal danger. Conrad's orders to the Second Army to attack without halting, with energy and regardless of loss, were likewise not passed to the troops by its commander, Böhm-Ermolli. The limits of human nature had been reached, and the commander-in-chief's orders for further battles fell on empty air. Late on the afternoon of the 11th, Conrad bowed to fate. The advance of the Second and Third Armies, he writes, had brought no effective decision. On the contrary, the risk of a breakthrough by two Russian corps behind the left wing of the Fourth Army threatened to place it in a catastrophic situation. In the circumstances, there was only one course of action which had to be brought on with all speed, namely to break off the battle and withdraw all the armies behind the Sun River. The order, which had been wrung from him by terrible and torturing events, was issued from Przemysl at 5:30 on the afternoon of the 11th. Almost on the very same hour Moltke acknowledged his defeat at the Battle of the Marne and ordered, through Colonel Hensch, the retirement of all the German armies of the centre and the right. Thus, both on the eastern and western fronts, the first mighty onslaught of the Central Empires, upon which almost their all had been staked, ended simultaneously in failure. We must now proceed to East Prussia and study at close quarters the events whose mere report on the night of the 1st of September so profoundly affected the Russian headquarters.